Warning, due to the nature of this series, this video will contain spoilers. You have been warned. For as long as I've placed a controller in my hand, I have been playing shooters. Whether they be westerns, sci-fi, World War II, or even horror titles, I have had my share of staring down the sights and squeezing the trigger. But it wasn't until I had played Spec Ops: The Line that I really considered the possible consequences of my actions in these games. Consider this: when you play a shooter, there's a pretty good chance that you are the good guy in the situation. Sure, there may be some collateral damage here and there, and perhaps you just so happen to commit a few war crimes. Heck, maybe the people you're fighting have wives and children at home, but that's okay, because at the end of the day, you're still doing good, right? You're still the hero, right? Right? Well, after playing through this game, not only was that train of thought completely derailed for me, but I also consider my actions throughout every single shooter that I've ever played. So, without further ado, let's take a trip into this extremely intelligent shooter, and reveal just why it's one of the best games I've ever played. The visuals in this game manage to tell a story all of their own. The environments showcase just how far the city of Dubai has fallen in this title. Once one of the most beautiful cities in the world, it has been reduced to ruin by massive sandstorms. As the team progresses, they get to see the remains of Lamborghinis, mansions, high-rise hotels, and skyscrapers. But in the end, that's all they are. Remains. Speaking of remains, the amount of detail that is put into the various bodies found lying around is quite disturbing, and really helps drive home the horror of this situation. Oh, and these aren't just the typical corpses found in most shooters. These are the remains of people lined up and shot, placed into mass graves, burned alive by white phosphorus, hung, and literally torn apart by the sandstorms. Yeah, in case you were wondering, this game doesn't glorify war in any way, shape, or form. But probably the best usage of the visuals is shown through the main character, Walker. In the beginning, he looks like the typical protagonist in most shooters. He is focused, determined, and in control of the situation. But as the game progresses, all three of those traits quickly and horribly escape his grasp. This is shown with the character model as he becomes beaten, bruised, burned, and scarred. These scars clash with his extremely blue eyes and make him look about as monstrous as he's become. The evolution of this storyline is wonderfully reflected in all of the visuals, but that's only one of the ways that this story is mirrored. The soundtrack of this title, while subtle, is very appropriately put together. For instance, in the main menu screen, Jimi Hendrix's rendition of the Star-Spangled Banner begins to play. Over the course of the campaign, not only does this menu screen reflect your party's progress, but the portion of the song being played also advances. However, with each advancement in the story, the song becomes more and more distorted. By the end of the campaign, not only is the American flag on the screen completely destroyed, but the song is barely recognizable over the sound of the sandstorm. Along with this, at various points in the game you will also hear songs such as Alice in Chains' Rooster and 9 Inch Nails' The Day the World Went Away, both of which greatly set the despondent mood, and one of which are about the horrors of the Vietnam War. These songs, combined with the constant movement of sand and wind, create the perfect setup for this barren wasteland with a horrible secret. If you've played any tactical third-person shooters, then you pretty much know what to expect from this game. But it's the little touches that make this game at least somewhat stand out from the crowd. First off, considering you take on the persona of a squad leader, you can give your team orders as to how they concentrate their fire. But E-Dog, some of you may be thinking, I've been doing that since Star Wars Republic Commando. A valid point. Heck, I've been doing it since XCOM. But this game adds a bit more flair to this element. In many instances, Captain Walker calls out his commands in a very specific manner, which makes sense because just yelling "shoot there" in a firefight will get you absolutely nowhere. But the addition of sand greatly changes things up. Thanks to the city mostly being buried by a sandstorm, you can fire upon weak glass to drown your adversaries underneath a dry river. Plus, considering the city is still ravaged by the sandstorms, the Delta Squad will have to fight their way through these blinding forces of nature just to reach their next objective. But wait, why are they fighting through all of this again? Wasn't their objective just to assess the situation and radio for evac? Huh. Funny how things work out sometimes, isn't it? The story of this game showcases one of the most disturbing, atrocious, and horrifying examples of warfare that I've ever seen in a video game. So much so that I occasionally had to stop playing to clear my head, and this game literally gave me nightmares for 3 days. In the beginning, it's not much more than a simple shooter. Your objective is to confirm the status of any survivors in this ravaged city and radio for evac. Then you find out that the locals are hostile, so you keep moving forward. Afterwards, you'll find out that CIA operatives are causing the locals to rebel against the US Army battalion stationed in the city, so you keep moving forward. But then it turns out that this battalion has gone rogue, so you keep moving forward. This chain of events just goes on and on, causing the body count to rise and the situation to worsen. But then, at some point, the player will probably remember, none of this was part of the mission. All that you had to do was radio for reinforcements, but you didn't. Did it matter that every step forward caused the situation to worsen? Did it matter that the other members of your team told you this much? Did it matter that the sanity of the main character was clearly slipping to the point that the loading screens mocked your actions? No. You just had to know what was going to happen. You just had to try to make things right. You just had to be something you're not. A hero. As I played through this campaign, I fell victim to this train of thought, and kept continuously hoping that somehow, some way, I could make things right. But surely this wasn't my fault. I couldn't have known that dropping white phosphorus on American soldiers would have resulted in the deaths of the civilians they were protecting. I couldn't have known that by pushing forward, one of my squad mates would end up lynched. And how was I supposed to know that the CIA operative I befriended was attempting to destroy the last remaining supply of water in the city, causing everyone, and the secret of what happened here, to die out? I didn't know, but it could have been prevented if I had just stopped. This brilliant deconstruction of the war shooter genre, along with the extremely disturbing visuals and events, makes this title more of a horror game than anything else. But in the end, I'm extremely glad that I went on this journey, as it has given me a much different viewpoint on these games, and has gifted me with an experience that I will remember for a long time. Despite the praise that I've given this title, it wasn't exactly universally acclaimed, and it has received its share of criticisms. So, I'll address some of said criticisms now. Number 1. This game is unnecessarily brutal. Well, I suppose that depends on how you look at it. The point of this game was to showcase just how desensitized many gamers have become from playing shooters. So, by forcing the player to see the results of their violence and destruction firsthand, this game really allows the player to see these games from a different viewpoint. Now, could the developers have done this in a different fashion? Sure. But I doubt that this point would be so memorable if they did. Number 2. This game is unrealistic. Sure, you could argue that most video games are unrealistic, but there are some instances in this title which greatly invoke this. First off, Walker would easily have died from most of his wounds. Yep, Walker falls off a skyscraper, flies off an exploding semi-truck, survives a helicopter crash, and falls through a glass ceiling of a high-rise building, just to name a few instances. So yes, Walker would most certainly be dead. But what's to say he isn't? In fact, there is a large amount of symbolism which all but confirms that he is. First off, in the middle of the game, the player replays the mission from the prologue, but at this point, Walker comments that they've done this before. Odd, but it gets more interesting. Once the helicopter crashes, Walker is treated to a vision of a flaming pillar, somewhat akin to hell. Add this in with the constant hallucinations that Walker suffers, and it's entirely possible that Walker dies at the beginning of the game, but is just seeing the events leading up to his demise. In other words, his life is flashing before his eyes. Now this theory isn't exactly set in stone, but take the final line from the best ending into consideration.
If you don't mind me asking, what was it like? How'd you survive all this?
Who said I did?
Furthermore, many people consider the actions taken by the protagonists unrealistic. In a real situation, these soldiers are all disobeying orders by attempting to solve the situation themselves. Furthermore, once it became apparent that Captain Walker was unfit for command due to his very clear sanity slippage, then it was the responsibility of the second-in-command, Lieutenant Adams, to relieve him of duty. Heck, even if Adams didn't feel the need to pull back, then Staff Sergeant Lugo had every right to disobey their orders, fall back, and radio for reinforcements. But none of them do. Every one of these characters realize that they're doing more harm than good by moving forward, but they rationalize their actions through a variety of defense mechanisms and excuses. Yes, in a real situation, they did not do the right thing. But that's not to say that this sort of thing couldn't happen. Number 3. The trailers were misleading. This is true, and you can thank 2K Studios for that. As the publishers, 2K didn't think that the game would sell very well unless the trailer made it look like most generic shooters. Not that this made the game sell very well anyway. Number 4. The multiplayer is unnecessary. You know what? I agree. And you know what else? So did the developers. Once again, you can thank 2K Studios for mandating that this game have multiplayer, as, once again, they felt that it wouldn't sell otherwise. So the multiplayer was outsourced to a different development studio and tacked onto the game. Now, I won't say that the multiplayer is bad. There are some very cool elements thrown in, such as random sandstorms, and as far as online multiplayers go, it's pretty straightforward. But for a title that heavily emphasizes the story of the campaign, this really didn't need to be a part of the game. And finally, number 5, your choices don't matter. Nope, they sure don't. Now, in BioShock Infinite, I really didn't understand why this was the case. However, in this title, I fully understand. Now, there are 4 possible endings, but they only change depending on your actions at the very end of the game. So you may be wondering why the player has any choice if the majority of them have no effect. Well, it's very simple. Throughout the campaign, you are always given the illusion that you may have a chance to make this situation better. This makes the players think back to previous games in which their choices actually did matter. But this time around, no matter what you do, things will constantly get worse. So you may be thinking, well, if that's the case, then I really don't have any choice at all, do I? Wrong. Just like the party in this game, you always had a choice. You didn't need to put the game in the console, you didn't need to keep playing, and you certainly didn't need to commit the heinous acts throughout the campaign. But you did, and that's a very important lesson from this title. In almost any situation where the phrase, "I had no choice" is used, it's usually a lie. You almost always have a choice. Now, let me just say that I'm not trying to condemn the shooter genre of video games. Heck, if this game was, then it would be extremely hypocritical. I've been playing shooters all my life, and I'll continue to do so. They're a great form of entertainment, and they improve upon reflexes, critical thinking, and can even teach history. I will say, however, that titles such as Spec Ops: The Line are very important to the gaming community, as they give a masterful deconstruction on a genre of which many of us have become jaded. But despite the horrors showcased in this love letter to Heart of Darkness, I've learned that I'm still one of the lucky ones. I can still go home. It's for this reason that Spec Ops: The Line is one of the best games I've ever played.